picture this. It's 2004.
Okay.
You're in a suburban living room in Houston, Texas, right? And there's this group of people fiercely debating a misplaced dot in a web address.
A URL dot.
Yeah, exactly. But they aren't talking about the internet. They're actually trying to translate a 1,300-year-old tragedy from the deserts of Iraq into modern English.
Wow.
Yeah, they're doing it for a younger generation that they don't really understand the poetry of their grandparents anymore. So to make a point about religious devotion, a local cleric tells them that missing a single ritual is literally like putting a dot in the wrong place in a URL.
You just won't reach your destination.
Right. You just get an error page.
It's such a striking image, honestly. You have this incredibly ancient, deeply poetic tradition of mourning, and suddenly it's being explained through the cold, sort of mechanical language of the early internet age.
Yeah.
It tells us so much about how memory struggles and adapts, really, when it crosses oceans.
Which is the entire mission of our deep dive today.
Yeah.
We are exploring how a singular historical tragedy from the 7th century hasn't just, survived, but has morphed into this dynamic tool for anti-colonial resistance, feminism, immigrant identity, and even intense poetic rivalries.
That covers a lot of ground.
It really does. And looking at your digital backdrop today, I gotta say, it sets the mood perfectly. You're sitting in front of the intricate arched architecture of a traditional South Asian ashrakana, right? Like a mourning shrine.
Yeah, exactly.
The draped banners, those towering alams, the illuminated manuscripts, it just feels heavily layered with history.
And that layered history is exactly what we're unpacking today. We're pulling from this incredible stack of sources to do it, too. We've got excerpts from Syed Akbar Hyder's book, Reliving Karbala, Martyrdom in South Asian Memory. We also have a scholarly chapter titled Empowering Grief by Eve Tignall, a really detailed summary from the MRRC library, and a brilliant lecture review from UT Austin focusing on the women of the Karbala tradition.
Okay, let's unpack this, because if we are going to understand how a 7th century event gets translated into a Texas living room, or, how it gets weaponized against the British Empire later on, we first need to understand what actually happened.
Right, the root of it all.
Yeah. What is the baseline event that created this massive blast radius of cultural memory?
Well, the anchor for all of this is the Battle of Karbala. The year is 680 CE, and the location is the desert of Karbala in present-day Iraq.
Okay.
And the core conflict centers on Hussein, who was the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad. Hussein basically refused to pledge allegiance to the reigning political ruler of the time, this guy named Yazid.
Why did he refuse?
Because Hussein viewed Yazid's rule as tyrannical, corrupt, and fundamentally un-Islamic.
So it starts as this profound political and moral standoff.
Exactly. A standoff with devastatingly lopsided odds. I mean, Hussein is traveling with a very small band of his family members and devoted followers. We're talking fewer than 100 people, and that includes women and children.
Wow. And they're going up against an army.
Yazid's massive, heavily armed military force. They intercept them, they cut them off from water for days, and ultimately, Hussein and his male companions are just brutally slaughtered.
That's horrifying.
It really is. The women and children are taken captive. And this slaughter essentially cemented the historical and theological divide between Sunni and Shia Muslims. For the Shia tradition, the martyrdom of Hussein becomes the definitive paradigm of suffering, injustice, and really the ultimate sacrifice for truth.
But the sources make it clear that the way this history is remembered isn't through, reading dry chronological accounts in a textbook.
No, not at all.
It is a highly physical, sensory experience for the people who practice it. Reading Syed Akbar Hyder's memoir of growing up Shia in Hyderabad, India, you really realize this isn't just a story told to children. It's a world they physically inhabit.
Yeah. The atmosphere he describes in the sources is entirely immersive. He details the arrival of Muharram, which is the first month of the Islamic calendar, and the primary period of mourning. Families don't just sit and reflect in quiet. They actively transform their environment. They whitewash the walls of their homes, completely stripping away the everyday decorations.
So the visual reset.
A total reset, and the air becomes thick with the scent of roses and burning aloe wood. They set up the alams, which are those ornate standards or banners like the ones you noted in my background representing the martyrs.
He also mentions getting a consecrated red thread tied around his wrist for existential protection.
Right, yeah.
And there's this tradition where children actually dress up as a fakir, a beggar, carrying a green pouch to receive sugar-coated nuts. They're taught that poverty and humility in the path of the martyrs is a point of immense pride.
Exactly.
But I'm struggling with the mechanics of this, honestly. Taking a massive abstract tragedy from a desert in Iraq and shrinking it down to a red thread on a schoolboy's wrist in India, isn't there a risk of trivializing the history by making it so hyperlocal?
What's fascinating here is that this localization is precisely the mechanism of its survival. Well, if a historical event remains distant and abstract, it fades, right? It becomes just a date on a calendar. But by tying that red thread, or setting up an alam in a local neighborhood, the devotees are essentially creating a living map of Karbala right on top of their own city. Hyderabad basically becomes Karbala.
Oh, wow. So they aren't just remembering a past event, they are importing it into their present reality.
Exactly. The ultimate expression of this in Hyderabad is the massive Ashura Day procession. The central Bibi Ka Alam is carried through the densely packed streets on the back of an elephant.
On an elephant? That's incredible.
Yeah, and it's surrounded by thousands of mourners chanting and weeping. When you are in that crowd, the timeline completely collapses. You are not a modern observer mourning a 7th century martyr. You are marching alongside Hussein's camp in real time. You are proving your allegiance in the present tense.
Okay, so if the physical streets map the grief, how do they translate the actual narrative of the story for an audience that doesn't live in the Middle East or speak 7th century Arabic? Because it seems like the rituals were heavily localized, but the language of the tragedy had to be entirely reinvented too.
It was. And it evolved into a highly sophisticated, high-stakes art form. This reinvention happened primarily in the Majlis, which is the traditional commemorative mourning gathering.
Okay.
And the central pillar of the Majlis is a poetic form known as the Marsiya. This is a linear, elegiac epic poem that recounts the specific events of the battle. But as this tradition flourished in South Asia, particularly around the 18th and 19th centuries, the poets began painting these Arab martyrs using entirely South Asian cultural brushes.
Right. I found the example in the sources from the 18th century poet Sauda completely fascinating.
Oh, the wedding one.
Yes. He writes a Marsiya about the tragic wedding of Hussein's nephew, Qasim. According to the tradition, Qasim was married to Hussein's daughter just moments before he rode out to fight and be killed.
Right, a very poignant moment.
But when Sauda describes this wedding, he doesn't describe an Arab ceremony in the desert. He describes it using local North Indian Hindu and Muslim rituals. He talks about the groom wearing a sara, which is the traditional Indian flower veil.
Yeah, and Sauda goes even deeper than just the physical garments. He incorporates profound local social anxieties into the poem.
What kind of anxieties?
Well, in 18th century India, the stigma of being a widow was life-shattering. So Sauda's poem features the bride's mother agonizing not just over the death of her new son-in-law, but over the social gossip and the ruinous, isolated fate of her daughter's sudden widowhood.
That's intense.
He even draws subtle poetic contrasts with the Hindu practice of sati, where a widow was historically expected to sacrifice herself on her husband's funeral pyre.
That is a massive leap. He is taking 7th century Arabian figures and injecting them with 18th century Indian societal fears. I mean, it makes the tragedy instantly, painfully relatable to the audience sitting in that room. It's basically brilliant marketing for the soul. And the sources note that by the 19th century in Lucknow, India, this art form became incredibly competitive.
Very competitive, yeah.
You had these two master poets, Mir Anis and Mirza Dabir, engaging in what basically sound like 19th century rap battles.
That is a remarkably accurate analogy, honestly. They were the undisputed heavyweight champions of sorrow in Lucknow. They held public, highly theatrical, poetic duels.
Like in front of massive crowds?
Yes. Their followers would fiercely debate who had the superior verse, and they even leveled accusations of plagiarism against each other.
No way.
Oh, yeah. They were competing to see who could leverage the classical Persian and Urdu ghazal tradition, which, remember, is typically the poetry of romantic love, nightingales and roses, and repurpose those metaphors to conjure the most devastating images of martyrdom.
Yeah, the sources mention Mir Anis famously writing a verse where he compares the mane of Hussein's horse to a fragrant hyacinth. He claimed the horse was so majestic and beautiful that it made the heavenly houris, the celestial maidens of paradise, jealous.
Beautiful imagery.
It is stunning, but honestly, wait, I'm genuinely skeptical here. They are literally making up a South Asian wedding for an Arab martyr. They are describing desert war horses as making angels jealous.
Right.
Doesn't that anger the historical purists? Isn't there a fine line between taking creative license and actively distorting religious history?
You've hit on a major tension within the tradition right there, which the text referred to as taris, the distortion or alteration of history. There's a deeply telling anecdote in the text about a cleric who attempted to give a stripped-down, historically accurate account of the battle.
What happened?
He suggested that Hussein's brother Abbas, who was exhausted, bleeding, and thirsty, leaned on a shrub for physical support during the grueling fight.
And the audience completely rejected it. The sources say they were outraged.
They were infuriated. Because if we view this through the lens of a modern historical documentary, the shrub makes perfect logical sense. Of course he would lean on a shrub.
Oh, he's human.
But these audiences aren't attending a majlis for a sterile documentary. They are engaging in a shared cultural and spiritual imagination. For the poetry to work its cathartic magic, the martyrs must exist in a paradox.
A paradox.
Yeah, they must be superhumanly perfect, courageous, and divine, yet they must also experience deeply, relatably human pain, like a mother singing a lullaby to an empty cradle. The anecdote about the shrub offends the audience because it introduces a mundane, unheroic human weakness, and that shatters the delicate architecture of the tragedy.
I see. They aren't looking for cold facts. They are seeking emotional truth.
Exactly.
But how does that emotional reservoir of grief move out of the mourning halls and onto the streets? Because the sources show that once this grief was perfected as an art form, it didn't stay confined to poetry. It became a master narrative for political revolution.
The meaning of Karbala expands dramatically when we look at the broader context. Yves Tignol's chapter in the MRC Library Summary highlight that Sufi Muslims have long celebrated the martyrs of Karbala, not merely as victims to be wept over, but as ideal lovers of the divine.
Ideal lovers.
Yeah. In Sufism, the ultimate spiritual goal is the joyful annihilation of the ego to attain subsistence in God. Hussein's sacrifice is viewed as the pinnacle of this ecstatic surrender.
So the narrative shifts from mourning a loss to celebrating a spiritual triumph.
Precisely. And in the early 20th century, that framework of triumph gets mobilized for earthly politics. The sources document how Sunni reformists, like the highly influential poet Muhammad Iqbal, and even non-Muslim political leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, began invoking Karbala.
Wow, Gandhi too.
Yes. We see this heavily during the Caliphate movement, an early 20th century pan-Islamic political campaign in India, and the broader anti-British protests.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I want to understand the actual rhetoric here. How do you convince an Indian population to fight the British Empire by referencing an Iraqi battle from over 1,000 years ago?
By fundamentally transforming the concept of grief. Yves Tignol describes this as the shift toward empowering grief. Muhammad Iqbal famously argued against simply crying over the ruins of the past.
Okay.
He proposed that passive victimhood was actually a betrayal of Hussein's legacy. If Hussein could stand up to the massive tyrannical army of Yazid with only 70-something followers, then the Indian population had a moral obligation to stand up to the might of the British Empire.
It's the ultimate underdog blueprint. You map the British colonialists onto the tyrant Yazid, and you map the oppressed Indian citizens onto Hussein. And suddenly, fighting the British isn't just a political choice, it's a sacred duty.
That's exactly how the rhetoric functioned.
The narrative is incredibly malleable. It can be picked up by a Shi'i poet, a Sunni reformist, or a Hindu nationalist, and used to rally people against whoever the current Yazid happens to be. But if this story is the ultimate tool for community building and resistance, who are the actual caretakers of this memory? Because the sources point out a group that is frequently sidelined in standard historical narratives, the women.
Oh, absolutely. The UT Austin lecture by Syed Akbar Hyder brings this to the forefront beautifully. The women of the Karbala tradition are not passive mourners weeping in the background while the men make history. They are the primary power brokers of the memory itself.
Like who?
Look at Zainab, Hussein's sister. After the slaughter at Karbala, she is taken captive and brought to the court of Yazid. But she doesn't cower. She delivers blistering, defiant political speeches that publicly shame the ruler and ensure that his version of events doesn't become the official history.
And the sources also highlight Hind, who is Yazid's own wife.
Right.
She ends up mourning the martyrs right inside the tyrant's own palace. It completely shatters the simple binary of who holds power and who experiences grief.
Furthermore, historically, women were the actual patrons and educators who ensured the Morsiya tradition survived. They funded the gatherings in their homes, they taught the poetry and the complex Urdu vocabulary to the next generation.
So they were basically running the infrastructure of the tradition.
Completely. They utilized the story of Karbala to teach intricate lessons of justice, ethics, and mercy through lived examples within the domestic sphere.
The UT Austin Lecture Review also connects those historical women to a modern Urdu writer, Karachalan Hyder. She wrote a piece called Tumult Rises in Prison for Hind Approaches, and she uses this historical framework to deliver a really sharp critique of our modern society.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Karachalan Hyder uses the Karbala narrative to create what is known as an alam ashob, a world of turmoil. She uses the intense, demanding grief of the women of Karbala to directly challenge our modern sense of spectatorship.
Oh man, think about how you scroll through your newsfeed today. You see a devastating war, a natural disaster, or a profound injustice. You might feel a fleeting second of pity, you might even share a post about it, and then you just keep scrolling.
Right. You move on to the next thing.
You remain a safe, passive observer. Karachalan Hyder argues that the women of the Karbala tradition demand active, embodied grief. They demand that you don't just watch the prison from the outside like a consumer of media. You have to psychologically and emotionally step inside the prison of the oppressed and share their burden.
It is a profound indictment of modern apathy. Mourning, in this tradition, is not a passive emotion. It is an ethical action. It forces complicity and demands solidarity. You cannot remain a cold, aloof observer if you are truly engaging with the Marsiya.
Which brings us right back to the image we started with. If this tradition relies so heavily on the physical streets of Hyderabad, the highly specific Urdu metaphors of Lucknow, and the intimate spaces of the home, what happens when a family packs up and migrates? Does the poetry survive the flight to a suburb in Texas?
The sources provide a vivid snapshot of this immense friction. It takes us back to that Majlis in a living room in Houston in 2004. You have devotees sitting in Texas, mourning a battle from 680 CE, while simultaneously watching live television news of bombings happening that exact day in Karbala in Pakistan.
Wow.
The physical and temporal distances completely collapse. As one person in the text notes, it perfectly encapsulates the traditional phrase, every day is a shurta, every land is Karbala.
But the text also points out what is being lost in that transition. In South Asia, the religious education of children often happened in the zanana, the women's section of the house.
Right.
It was a space filled with the poetry, the localized proverbs, and the beautiful ambiguity of the grandmothers. But in the U.S. diaspora, that nuanced grandmotherly Urdu is kind of fading.
It is, yeah. And it is often replaced for the younger English-speaking generation by a more rigid, literal, almost hyper-masculinized interpretation of Islam that strips away a lot of that poetic ambiguity.
Which brings us back to that cleric in Houston. Instead of using the classical ghazal metaphors of the nightingale and the rose to explain devotion, he uses the analogy of a misplaced dot in a web address.
Exactly.
It's effective for a kid who grew up on the internet, but it feels so mechanical compared to mere honest describing a horse that makes angels jealous. But it's not just the language that is under pressure in the diaspora, it's the physical practices too. I want to make sure I'm following the sources on this. There are intense intra-community debates happening right now over practices like Martyrdom, right?
Yes. Very intense.
Yeah.
Martyrdom refers to the physical acts of mourning, which can sometimes include instrumental flagellation, using blades to cut the skin, or practices like firewalking.
Oh, wow.
The sources impartially document how this creates fierce internal division. On one side, you have devotees who view cutting themselves or walking on fire as the ultimate profound defiance of the flesh. It is a physical, visceral manifestation of their willingness to suffer for Hussein's cause. It proves their devotion goes beyond mere words.
But the sources also note there is massive pushback against this.
Extensive pushback. Critics, and this includes prominent Shia clerics, as well as Orthodox, Sunni, and Wahhabi groups, strongly condemn it.
What's their argument?
Well, the theological argument against it is that drawing blood nullifies the state of ritual purity required for daily prayers. Furthermore, many argue it is an un-Islamic cultural accretion that turns a solemn spiritual remembrance into a bloody public spectacle, one that invites negative stereotypes and misunderstanding from the wider Western public. This raises an important question. How does a community preserve the poetry and ambiguity of its faith when placed in a completely new, sometimes defensive cultural context?
I mean, when you are a minority community trying to define your identity in a new homeland, how do you preserve the profound depth of your faith? Do you harden your boundaries, sanitize the rituals, and lose the poetry? Or do you adapt to the new culture and risk losing the core of the tradition entirely?
It is the defining struggle of migration, honestly, how a community translates its soul into a new vernacular without losing its original meaning.
So, what does this all mean? If we step back and look at the massive journey we've just taken, From the blood-soaked sands of 7th century Iraq to the opulent, competitive poetry duels of 19th century India,
Yeah.
from the fiery anti-colonial rallies of the British Empire to a living room in Texas trying to make sense of the internet and live cable news. Karbala proves one essential point. History is not a fixed point trapped in amber.
It's really not.
It is raw clay, and each generation takes that clay and reshapes it, whether into a flower veil for a martyr, a political protest, or a new ethical framework to survive its own unique tragedies and resist its own specific oppressors.
It demonstrates the incredible endurance of human memory and our continuous desperate need to find meaning and agency in the face of suffering.
And that leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over. Think about your own family's foundational stories. Maybe it's a story of an immigrant journey, a tale of surviving a war, or how your grandparents overcame a great financial or personal loss. Over the decades, as that story has been told at dinner tables or quiet moments, how much of it has been subtly rewritten?
Right.
Not out of deception, but to give you the specific psychological armor you need for the world you are facing today. Because just like that intricate Ashrakana behind you, our past isn't just a backdrop, it's the lens through which we survive the present. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.